Hi, so I wanted to do a brief Chekhov introduction for word number 6. I know there's a ton to tell you about this story in advance. Um, One thing I think that's important to know is that Chekhov is a doctor. He's a medical doctor, and that's primarily how he supports himself. And so one of the things that you'll notice in this story, which is set a good 50 years in the future from Gogol, from what we just read. We're jumping ahead to the late 1800s. Is that he is paying particular attention to what would at the time have been considered, clinical diagnostics for mental health, for mental illness, right? And so he's qualified to do that because he's a doctor. Chekhov is this interesting person. He was born poor. He became a doctor. He wrote entirely just to support himself. He got a little more famous and sometimes became he sort of got patronized by wealthier people. And in fact, very shortly before writing ward number 6, and you'll see how this resonates in the story, he was invited by one of his patrons to go on this tour of Europe. The entire time he hated it. He was too poor to do anything that the patron wanted to do. He was exhausted by it, longed to get home to his work. And so we can definitely see that, you'll definitely see that in reading ward number 6. He was very concerned with marginalized people. One of his very first projects as a writer was that he went to Sakhalin Island, which was a penal colony. He did medical work there, but he also took careful interviews with the subjects of, or with the convicts there. And then as soon as he got home, he immediately began a project that he worked on for years and years to gather books to send to Sakhalin Island, which is the far, far east of Russia, so that they could have a prison library. And he wrote a book about his experiences on Sakhalin Island that was extremely sympathetic to the plight of the prisoners that were there. It was basically a prison camp. And this concern for marginalized people endures throughout his life, and I think we can see that in this story too. As a writer, he has a very realistic style. And in the story, I think we need to consider a few things in terms of what can be of use to us. So one thing that he does is to create psychological profiles of the two main characters, right, of Reagan and Gromov. And I think one thing that it's worth time to do, either Yin's on the discussion board or, when we have the Zoom call on Tuesday, is to think through those depictions of Gromov and Reagan, and as it relates to their mental health symptoms, but also as people in the world, right? Because Chekhov also in the story devotes a great deal of time to describing, and now we're not in St. Petersburg, we're in some small town out in the hinterlands, but to describing the society and the culture there. And additionally, this sort of institutional culture, there's discussion of local governments as they relate to regional governments in terms of funding for the hospital and the mental ward there and healthcare and so forth, right? And so Chekhov is very, in a sense, concerned with context, social context, as well as with the psychologization of his characters. He tackles both. In that, it's like Gogol, except that, Gogol is presenting us with this very first-person account, right? And Chekhov as author is more like a doctor here, right? That he is sort of critically observing and assessing the details of the two people in the story, the two main characters in the story, as well as other characters. And then also their social and political and institutional situation, right? And so I think thinking about the ways those things overlap and intertwine is an important part of understanding the story. I would also say that the other thing that Chekhov does is engage these two characters in a discussion of ideas, right? We have them stake out these philosophical propositions, right? That Reagan takes this very stoic point of view that, I mean, literally stoic, the idea that pain or deprivation may objectively occur to a person, but that suffering is an internal condition that one can control. And he says that a thinking man, will be just as happy as Archimedes in his tub, as in a mansion. And Gromov comes back with a much more materialist view. He says, no, no. The world is real, and our material conditions matter. And so, on one hand, this is a very abstract debate. They literally have this abstract debate, these two characters, between this kind of materialist and idealist position about suffering, about how much the material conditions of our lives affect us psychologically. And there's a way in which, you might be like, well, how does that relate to the other content, which is sort of about diagnosing mental illness and situating it in the society that Chekhov is familiar with at the time, and figuring out the intersection of those things, of the personal and the public, and how it relates to mental illness. And what madness, in a sense, therefore, says about those those public institutions, beyond just what madness says about the individual and their circumstances, which is all well and good. But then there's the introduction of this kind of abstract, philosophical debate into the story, and that Chekhov pays careful attention to. And I think I'd like to ask you in particular to try to think through that and maybe write through that in comments and sort of bring it with you on Tuesday. But I will say that I think personally that it has to do with Chekhov providing us with some guidance about not just what the world is like, but what to do about it, right? If we were just saying that it is hard to live in the world sometimes, well, then how do we live in the world, right? I think Chekhov, more than our previous authors, picks up this question. Okay, then how do we live in the world? So those are kinds of the main idea, the main themes that I think it's worth concentrating on and thinking through. And so I'd like to invite you to sort of think about those things in your groups and on the main discussion board, etc. And then when we get to Tuesday, and then if we need extra time to talk, we can also do Thursday next week too, because it is a lengthier story than than the things we've been reading. So, we can see how it goes. But yeah, that's what I would say. That's what I would say about Chekhov and Ward number 6 going into it. And I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday morning.